All right, so we talked about objectives, we did that little story with Martin and the dragon. Now let's actually get a formal definition of what recursion is. And secondly, let's talk about why you should care. I did a little bit of, I wasn't trying to scare anyone, but I did a little bit of talking at the beginning about how recursion can be tricky. So let's talk about why it's worth it, why you should care, and why you should push through it if you do have a hard time getting it right away. But first, a definition. What is recursion? It's just a process that calls itself. And in our case, in everything we do in JavaScript or in code, when we say recursion, we're referring to a function that calls itself. So we've seen many a function that calls other functions. That's very, very common. We could have a function called laugh, and inside of it, we would call console.log potentially. That's a function call inside of a function. What's different about recursive functions is they call themselves. So our laugh function inside would call laugh. And you can imagine, first of all, that might make your head hurt already. But then imagine that it's happening over and over and over again, and there has to be some endpoint. Or if we go back to this slide here we have, imagine that we have a function called check for odds. We would call it here, and then in check for odds, it would call itself again on a smaller list. And then that would call check for odds over and over and over again. There has to be an endpoint, of course, or else we just keep going like an infinite loop. But it's slightly different than an infinite loop. But we'll get there. So let's leave it at that. It's a function that calls itself. Now, why should you care? Why do you need to know this? There's a bunch of reasons. First of all, it's everywhere. It's used all the time. We're going to use it a lot in the course for a lot of the solutions we write later on. But even before that, if you've been writing JavaScript, you've probably been using recursive functions without knowing it. Things like json.parse or json.stringify. If you've ever made an AJAX call and gotten JSON back and turned that into JavaScript, then you may have called a recursive function. Now, json.parse, json.stringify are up to the JavaScript engines to implement. So Mozilla has their own, Rhino, I think, their own implementation where they write json.parse how they want to. And it doesn't have to be written recursively, but it often is. So the point that I want to make is not that it's guaranteed that you've called a recursive function, but that json.parse is often written recursively. And actually, I have the source code open for Rhino, and this is the engine that Mozilla uses, and it's written in Java, so don't worry about the syntax. But if we look, it's not as simple as json.parse calling json.parse immediately. Instead, there's a function called readValue, this method here, and readValue calls things like readObject. So let's just focus on those two. readValue, you call that. It calls readObject. Well, if we look at readObject, in the middle of readObject, if we scroll down a bit, it calls readValue again. So then readValue is called, and that could call readObject, and we end up with this cycle where even though it's spread across two different methods, they are calling each other. So readValue is calling readObject, which is calling readValue, which calls readObject, and it's this cycle that goes over and over and over. So that's an example of recursion. But let me show you a simpler implementation. Here's a simpler implementation written in JavaScript. So this is not actually what's used in any of the browsers because browsers aren't written. JavaScript isn't written in JavaScript, but here's an implementation to show what it would look like. So I'm going to take a look. There's this method called walk, which is, here's json.parse. So it's called walk. And inside of walk, it's calling walk. I don't know if you can see that. Oh no, I lost it. There we are. So walk is called inside of walk. It calls itself over and over. I'm getting tired of saying the word walk. It starts to sound very bizarre when I repeat it that much. But what it's doing, if you think of a JSON, a string, it's all nested. When it says walk, it's going to move down sort of to the next line or to the next thing to parse over and over and over until it hits the end. Okay, so a bit of a tangent, but maybe somewhat interesting. Those are two examples, json.parse and stringify. Document.getElement by ID in DOM traversal algorithms. So remember that the DOM is this tree structure where we have all these nested things. They could be 100 layers nested, full of a div inside of a div inside of a div. And if we're trying to search through all of them, one popular approach is to write code that does it recursively. Object traversal, which is just like traversing JSON. Now, aside from these functions like json.parse and getElement by ID, query selector, things that we've used before probably, we're also going to be writing a lot of our own recursive functions later on. So when we write our own data structures, when we create trees or graphs, for example, when we want to traverse them, when we want to search for something across them, often the solutions involve recursion. Now remember, you don't have to do anything recursively, but sometimes it's easier. Let's put it that way. It's cleaner and simpler to understand rather than doing it without recursion. And I just got ahead of my bullet point here. It's sometimes a cleaner alternative to iteration. So we'll see some examples. We're going to write a couple functions both ways, with and without recursion, and I think we'll make it a little clearer that sometimes it's nicer. So why you should care? One, it's everywhere. You've been using it. That doesn't really matter, I guess, because it doesn't impact how you use things like JSON.parse, but it really is important once we get into these more advanced data structures and we're writing our own parse functions or our own get element by ID, traversing a tree, for example. All right, so I'll leave this video off.